Okay, so in the last video you saw what the current game actually looks like, and what you can expect to play right now if you've pre-ordered. So let's take a look at the world generation pipeline, where the bulk of my work was in this update. Before I go into the different stages, let me talk a little bit about how the generation works in general. In Pre-Alpha 4, my idea for the world generation was very similar to how the other procedural games like Minecraft and No Man's Sky do it. We take a bunch of math functions that go on forever, and combine them in interesting ways to create believable terrains and biomes. So in Pre-Alpha 4 you can walk and walk forever in every direction, finding new mountains, forests, hills, and plains. Now that's okay if the game is mostly focused on nature, but in Survive the bulk of your time will be spent in large, dense cities and towns, which will all need to be procedurally generated and fit correctly into the natural world. This noise system works by saying, okay, at this point in the world this is what the terrain will look like, and it can instantly do that for any position extending out forever. But what if you need to create a cohesive city in this world? Sure, you could flatten an area and put a city there, but where do you place the cities? How do you lay them out in real time as you move through the world? I'm sure it could be done, but it would be needlessly complicated, and for what? The only benefit you really get from doing it that way is you can go in all directions forever. But do we actually want that? The answer is no, not really. A fixed size world that wraps around is much more realistic, easier to generate, and allows for the generated world itself to be much more interesting. People sort of want to say, hey, our game is a limited size, you can play it forever. But in reality, you don't need a map larger than Earth or anything even close to that. I think the majority of you will not leave your home continent, and even if you do, being able to fly to another continent or completely circle the world, all of which is possible in Survive because of the fixed size, is really, really cool. So while you may think you want to play in an unlimited world, it's much cooler to be in a really dense and lush fixed size planet. So the size of the world right now is just 1,000,000 meters squared. For comparison, GTA 5 is about 80,000 meters squared. This is just an arbitrary size right now that sort of seems good, but I can change it at will by just modifying the number in the config file. I can make it as big or as small as I want. It's more of a matter of making sure we're generating a solid dense world to explore, which may mean the map size will end up being smaller. The size of the world is just another variable that will be tweaked and iterated on throughout development, so you don't really need to worry about it. So now that we know a little bit more about the generation, let's jump into the generation pipeline stages. The reason I split it up into stages was because generation is not super fast. Each stage can take a few minutes depending on its complexity, and redoing the continent generation just to test the change to the road generation is really stupid. So each stage saves its output to a file that the next stages use for their generation. This way I can iterate on stuff really quickly, which is vital for this sort of stuff. The first stage in this pipeline is continent generation. This stage uses plate tectonic simulation to create realistic continents and oceans. The simulation moves the plates around the world and creates high-level terrain based on their collisions and interactions. This is a debug view where you can see the different plates and the direction they were moving to generate this world. The plan is to add much more to this simulation, which is fairly simple right now. An example of something I want to add is moisture simulation to generate biomes. But like I said in the last video, and will be saying throughout this one, my primary focus was on the pipeline itself. I only wanted to create basic generation algorithms that get the job done. There are also a ton of different knobs and settings for this that can be tweaked to create wildly different worlds. These are just the settings that I quickly settled on so I can move on to the next stage. So after we have the continents, we move to stage 2, which is city placement. This stage is fairly straightforward. It just tries to place a random number of cities of random size around the map. It will tend to place more cities near water like in real life and will try to avoid mountain ranges. In the future, these cities will use biomes and moisture information for their placement. Once the cities are placed, it goes through and generates a population map using some random noise and the city positions. This map is just a texture that tells us where the population is around the world. This is really important when we start generating the city roads. The next stage is Interstate Generation. So in this stage, we take those cities and do our best to connect them to each other with a series of interstates. My first idea for this was to use pathfinding to avoid mountains and other hazards. But when studying maps in real life, generally interstates are just more or less straight connections between cities. So that's what the current iteration does. It makes a straight line between every city, then adds a little noise to make it more interesting and realistic. Once the interstates are connecting cities, we then have to connect the interstates to each other within the cities. This is a bigger challenge than it seems, but now all the interstates cross through the cities in interesting ways and they end up conglomerating into a handful of large interstates that can be named in-game for easier navigation. This ends up working out like it does in real life, where a number of named interstates like I-10 or I-35 connect multiple cities across the continent. So we have a planet, city locations, and an interstate network. Now onto the hardest stage of them all, city road generation. This takes everything from the previous stages and generates the cities themselves. Each city is done on a different thread to speed up performance. The generation of a city is sort of a little mini pipeline in itself. It starts by growing a set of main city roads. These are large capacity roads that are sort of the arteries of the city. After that, we run another set of growth rules to create the secondary roads that connect the main roads to all the different city blocks. After that, we generate the different city blocks off these secondary roads. Right now we're just generating neighborhoods, but in the future shopping centers, prisons, schools, and everything else that makes up a city will come off of these secondary roads. Like all the other generation algorithms in this video, these roads are very early and still have a ton of work that needs to be done. But it does do the job of making simple cities with neighborhoods to explore. You can also see when we zoom in that houses are being placed along all the roads in the cities and pruned so they don't overlap roads or each other. These houses should really only be placed on the neighborhood roads, but that will be fixed in the future. With this, we have enough to start working on the in-game stuff. At this point, we have all the offline generation done, and we save all the data as a series of small world chunks into a custom binary format designed for efficient streaming. So the next stage in the pipeline is to get into the game and start loading all this data. To stream the data, we just grab all the chunks around the player and load them in. There is a problem currently where we have to load in a chunk at full detail, so the view distance can't be very far. The next step will be to load in low detail chunks in the distance. With this, we can get really far city view distances which are really important for exploration. To get around this, I added in a basic low detail streaming of boxes, just to show you where distant houses are so you can see an entire city in game. Soon, those will actually be low detail versions of houses and roads. So loading in all that generation data is somewhat easy. The real challenge is taking that data and actually creating a physical world out of it. First, we have to take all those road splines and create meshes that accurately handle intersections dynamically. Like I said in the last video, the intersection handling is currently broken, but more or less implemented. After the road meshes are created, we also have to make sure that terrain is smoothed out under the roads. Because this area is mostly flat, you can't see it, but terrain will smooth out to fit roads. The terrain also has to push down a little bit under the road so that it can line up correctly with the sidewalk. Here's a screenshot of the road smoothly flattening the terrain so you can see the system in action. Now that we have road meshes that fit perfectly into the world, we need to actually make some buildings. The first building we're generating is a single-story house. Again, the generation algorithm is the first iteration and it's just to get the process working and make some semi-believable houses. This generation algorithm works by starting with the house boxes placed in the offline generation and randomly chopping and moving their exterior walls to make an interesting shape. After that, we go through and make some interior walls, then use those walls to place pieces of the roof. As you can see when I flip through a bunch of variations, it has a ton of issues, but can sometimes make nice houses. I'm not going to talk about the algorithm itself because it will most likely be completely replaced with a new iteration before long. My focus was on taking a set of 2D walls and turning them into an in-game mesh. The way this is done is pretty simple. We just convert it to a 2.5D voxel grid. There's a lot wrong with the generation, but one thing that always works is every room is accessible thanks to this voxel grid. All the rooms are always connected to each other and the outside. Once the grid is all set up, we have enough information to place the wall meshes, doors, windows, roof meshes, floors, ceilings, and trimming. We also have enough information to start placing interior props and loot, which will be in the next update. After a house is generated, it's placed into the world, some trees and zombies are spawned, sprinkle a little grass, and you've got the current state of the game. So these last two videos have been pretty dense because it's been over a year since the last update, but I hope I was able to show all of you why this was necessary. I really hated not being able to release an update for so long, but I feel like it needed to be done to lay this core foundation which is just so important to the game. Now that this foundation is set, content updates are going to start flowing really quickly. So I hope you guys are ready, because the game is going to start growing rapidly. Thanks for watching, I'll see you soon.